Welcome to ReligionWise, the podcast where we feature educators, researchers, and other professionals discussing topics on religion and their relevance to the public conversation. My name is Chip Gruen. I'm the director of the Institute for Religious and Cultural Understanding at Muhlenberg College, and I will be the host for this podcast. In this, Season 2 of ReligionWise, we will continue to consider a broad variety of religious and cultural beliefs and practices, and try to understand their place in the contemporary conversation. If you like what you hear, I encourage you to explore the 12 episodes from Season 1 that are available in your favorite podcast app. Also, we would love to hear from you with your questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes. To reach us, please visit our website at religionandculture.com. There, you will find our contact information and also have the opportunity to support this podcast and the work of the Institute. Today's guest is Kocku von Stuckrad, who's a professor of religious studies at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. I first met Dr. von Stuckrad when Muhlenberg College was arranging a memorandum of understanding with the University of Groningen for student and faculty exchange and generally cooperate on joint ventures. At the same time, as I was getting to know him through those channels, I was also starting to use his work in several of my classes, and I just want to take a second to sort of share how instrumental his work has been. I teach a number of classes that serve as an introduction to comparative religions. Two that I'll mention, one is called Religion and Popular Culture. The other is called Animals and the Sacred. And in both of those courses, and even a few others, I start off with Kocku von Stuckrad on Discourse. And one of the reasons I do that is because it serves as a really great starting point in thinking about topics of religion. So how I like to describe it is when we're talking about religion, what are we talking about? Or how do we talk about religion when we're talking about religion? And his discursive analysis, so in his two most recent books, Discursive History of the Soul, the other is on the conjunction of the discourses of science and religion. He doesn't talk about what is the soul or what is science, but how we go about talking about those things and how we talk about those things, the narratives we build around those abstract concepts hold power and hold influence on how we both navigate and describe our own world. So it becomes a really great starting point for thinking about any number of things that we've dealt with on other episodes of the podcast. So in addition to his thinking through the lens of discursive analysis, some of Dr. von Stuckrad's work and some of his earlier work in particular has to do with secrecy and histories of esotericism or discourses on esotericism. And I think it's a really interesting additional avenue of his work to think about the idea of public and private knowledge, of religious systems that use discourses of privacy to enhance their own cachet or credibility. And in particular, if we think about contemporary ideas about conspiracy and secrecy, that his work is really relevant to some of those conversations as well. So it's really exciting for me to have this world-renowned scholar of religious studies, one of the leading voices, not only in Western Europe, but in global academic study of religion, to come and talk about this really important concept with us today. So Kocku von Stuckrad, welcome to ReligionWise. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for inviting me.
So I wanted to sort of start off broad and then get a little bit more specific with our conversation today. And one of the developments, I think, in the study of religion and culture over the last, decade, you can correct me, a couple of decades, I suppose, is the idea of discursive analysis and thinking about discourse. Now, we've all heard the word discourse before, but I've heard it used in the, I hesitate to say incorrect way, right? But as a synonym for conversation or a synonym for talking generally. How do you understand this word discourse in your work?
Yeah, you're totally right. There has been a lot of discussion about discourse, and also very different ways of doing the term, both in the study of religion, but also in cultural studies all over the place. Many people talk about discourses, but there are very different understandings involved there. And in the study of religion, and we can also use that same question for other things that we might be interested in, science or law or whatever. It's the ultimate question is, do you talk about the things themselves? Religion is something, or are you talking about what people think religion is? So do you talk about ideas about religion or science or law or whatever, what have you? And that is exactly what the difference is in the study of religion or in other disciplines as well, between a discursive approach and other approaches, because discursive approaches are interested in discourses on something and discourses on religion, what people think about religion, how do they define religion. So you don't come up with a definition yourself to start with, but you are interested in, okay, these people talk about religion in this way, and it's not spirituality, it's not science, it's something else, and you study how these uses are set up in a certain context. And what makes discourses interesting, it's not only the term or the language that you study, like in text analysis or something, but discourses are practices. That means that discourses also establish orders of knowledge, and therefore they are also linked to some kind of hegemonial dimension. So what is possible to think about religion, for instance, is a discourse. We cannot think maybe out of the box, you might say, but this is mainly then kind of controlled or directed by knowledge that we just share through what we call discourses. And these are then also practices in the sense that what we think about the world, these orders of knowledge about the world, are also legitimized. They are made plausible because there are churches, so there must be religion or something. There can be even architecture, there can be disciplines at university about something that gives legitimacy to something in a certain context. And these are all discourses on, and if you study discourses, then you are interested in how orders of knowledge are set up. And these are shared basically in a group, in a society, in a large section of society. And they can also change, but they are basically shared opinions. And in this understanding of knowledge, opinion and knowledge is not a big difference. So it's not about what is true knowledge, but what is kind of understood as reality or as truth in a certain context. Sorry for the long answer.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I want to push on a couple things because I know, and I'm sort of torn as to whether to read your formal definition or not, because I don't want to read your own work back to you. But there are a couple aspects of it that I really want to push, that I always call out to students that I'm reading this with. And I want to get your take on the relationship between the two. The first is the idea that these are social, right? So that if I'm just going through, okay, I've teased it, I need to read it now. So the formal definition you give in a couple places is discourses are practices that organize knowledge in a given community. They establish, stabilize, and legitimize systems of meaning and provide collectively shared orders of knowledge in an institutionalized social ensemble, statements, utterances, and opinions about a specific topic, systematically organized and repeatedly observable form of discourse. And the thing that I always point out to students is if you just go through that, community, collectively shared, social ensemble, that the idea of sort of group is so important here, right? To really, to really emphasize what the anthropologists will call sort of a cultural component of discourse. So that's the one thing. And then the other thing, and you don't use power in here, but I'll have you know I group you with Assad sometimes on my syllabi, but you don't use power here, but the idea of legitimization and organization and so forth. And so, I would like to get your take on the one hand, the idea of the communal aspect of this, and on the other hand, that there is this cultural power, right? That is not 1984 authoritarian style power, but it is sort of the power of something that is in many ways ineffable. The water that we drink, the air that we breathe, that's all around us. Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between community and power there?
Yeah, these are two very, very important components of the whole discursive approach. The one, like you said, there's no discourse without groups. There's no discourse without kind of communication across individuals. So you can have individual experiences all over the place, of course, but to talk about a discourse, or meaningfully to talk about a discourse, would need some shared understandings of something. So there must be a shared understanding, and that can be, like Foucault talked about, that can be tacit knowledge. That can be something you don't realize, you think. For instance, that Christianity is better than Islam or something, or that magic is not as good as science, something like these. Most people don't really think about it, but they still have certain understandings of the world in certain contexts. That in different countries it might be different, in a different context it might be different, but it's always a kind of understanding that is shared in a group context. And these can be large groups like states, or like whole parts of nations and so on. So these are very influential orders of knowledge that then also resonate with what these communities do. The papers they read, the disciplines they study, or whatever is part of the sharing of certain understandings of the world. And a lot of research in discourse research is also interested in power, like you said, and Foucault as well was one of that. And then part of the discursive approaches is even calling itself critical discourse analysis. And this critical discourse analysis focuses particularly on the question, who is behind, whose interests are these discourses serving? Who is behind this? For instance, in the colonial context, you could say that colonizers were very interested in having certain understandings of religion over against animism or magic, which the indigenous people do, but they are not yet religious. They are not as civilized as we are. And that would be an example that discourse analysis would be very critical to kind of reveal the hidden power structures that are involved there. And that is one important aspect of it. But I would, in my own work, I do not think that it is all about this deconstructing and revealing of power structures. It is also just like what the sociology of knowledge does, just describing what's going on, what people think, and there are competing discourses maybe, and you can reconstruct the history of a certain involvement or a certain discursive development, and these can change depending on power relations, but not only.
Yeah, so I want to give I want to sort of stay here just one more minute, and then I want to get into some more specific discourses that you deal with in your work. But I want to talk a little bit. I've got two objections. One I'm going to share with you now. The other one I'm going to share later on in the podcast, because it's a little more a little more confrontational, I guess. But the first one is you refer to this actually in your article, Discursive Study of Religions, Approaches, Definitions, and Implications, as the death and furniture argument or the death in furniture objection, and I'll get you to explain what that is. But I'll say just in passing that I am guilty of this, because when I'm teaching postmodernism, I very often will use a chair as my example of what do we perceive to be a chair or not. And of course, I'll hop up and sit on a desk or something and say, well, is it a chair then? Right. And talk about, so could you describe, so I'm guilty of the furniture part, not the death part, but could you describe a little bit about the death and furniture objection?
Yeah, I mean, this is part of a important discussion in the social sciences in general, and in religious studies as well, about the level of constructivist elements in our theorizing. And then there are extreme poles. Say that the realist pole would be that, okay, there is reality and we can actually describe it. So a chair is a chair, right? Yeah. And then there's the other extreme. It says there's nothing can be taken for granted, or we can take nothing as real because everything is only socially constructed. And that would be the other extreme, like if you sit on a table, then it's a chair. And these are the two extremes that are theoretically, and there are a few people who have this position, but the majority is somewhere in the middle. And discursive approaches certainly come out of this constructivist trend in the social sciences and the humanities that was very, very dominant since the 1970s, basically. Before that, there was more of the realistic thing, but the critical deconstruction, or the construction of knowledge as socially shared and constructed, is something that was a very strong paradigm in the second half of the 20th century. And discourse research certainly comes out of that and is more interested in how people construct chairs or religion or magic, rather than what this really is. I mean, we are not really interested in deciding for them if this is true or not. So there are less ontological kind of statements in this, and that's part of all these constructivist approaches. Let me say one interesting thing that has happened over the last 10, 15 years is that the pendulum is in the social sciences and the humanities is swinging a little bit to the other side again, and that comes with these new materialisms, with these not necessarily realistic in the philosophical sense. We know about true reality, but there's a counter critique saying that, okay, you run into something and you bounce. So there's some resistance in the real world that you cannot just construct. And there is some kind of level of ontology or reality out there that we have to take into account as maybe not exactly the thing that we can describe with our models of reality, but there's certainly reality there that is robust in a sense that we cannot make up anything. And there is a kind of move also in discursive study of religion to say, okay, how do we deal with what today often is called agency of the material world? How do we deal with kind of the world talking back somehow, the non-human world talking back to us? And how do we include that in our discursive analysis? And I think that is a very, it is possible to include that in discursive approaches. I don't think that is that we need to give up a discursive analysis, but it is interesting to see what happens when we include the agency of non-humans, for instance, in our discursive analysis.
So I want to go back just a little bit to put a finer point on something, because you talk about sort of from the 70s on this postmodern turn. You mentioned Foucault, et cetera. And I think the majority of our listeners, whether they would put it in these terms or not, would probably be modernist in some way, right? I think, and actually that will end up being a question as well, right? Is how much of this is in the academy and how much of this does this trickle out into affecting, public discourse as well as academic discourses. But, when we think about modernism, I like to think particularly about, the turn of the 19th into the 20th centuries, where we had things like, the examples I always use are something like encyclopedia companies going crazy, right? They're wanting to do a compendium of human knowledge and put it in 26 volumes or what have you, and then be able to have it on your shelf and know, that this thing describes the nature of reality. Or the other one that I point to is the American Kennel Club, right? And breed standards. The idea that a German Shepherd or something didn't exist, as a breed until people decided to get together and decide what a real German Shepherd is. It's got to be this tall and it's got to have this color coat and it has to have this disposition. But then it was sort of determined that this is now the nature of reality of that breed, right? So that there's that modern, and I could mention things like the Miss America pageant doing something very similar, but that's really kind of gross, so I won't. But this idea of describing and cataloging sort of the perfect sort of specimen or exemplar of a thing, right, is, I think, at the heart to some degree of the modernist move. Or, for example, the World's Fairs or the World Parliament of Religion, like all of these things that are looking to catalog and put in one place. And then postmodernism really turns that move on its head. But that modernism is still very much around in public conversation, right? People really do believe in the firmness of their own reality. I think in most cases, would you agree with that?
I think that's an apt description of what was going on and what is still going on, and I think it is also interesting to see this as part of a larger development that has to do with what self-work on what does it mean to be modern, right? And this cataloging and this description and this organizing knowledge, objective knowledge about the world is a kind of identity marker for discourses on modernity, in the sense that everything is theoretically understandable about the world, and we only have to look for it, and then we find it, and then we catalog it, and also secure it somehow and control it. So there are all these kind of understandings of knowledge as and description as controlling something and being in power and so on. So that is certainly part of the modernist and also the understanding of what is the progress of modernity over against earlier periods, and that's also then linked to what happened to religion or to metaphysics or to mysticism or all these things that are allegedly non-describable in that exact sense. You cannot set up an experiment for it and all these things. So there are this reductionist approach to reality is not easily applicable to these phenomena. And that also changed the status of religion or the discourses on religion over against other phenomena in the 20th century.
Yeah, and so let's make the move into talking about particular discourses that you're interested in and that you've published monographs on, and I'll start with the first volume I want to talk about. Is entitled The Scientification of Religion, a historical study of discursive change from 1800 to 2000. And in particular, I want to talk about what you describe sometimes as a discursive knot, and tell me if you think that this a knot, KNOT, right, like two ropes tied together. I always think of it in my mind like a braid, like they're braided together. That science and religion, right, and I think that a lot of us, if we pay attention to public conversation or political conversation, that our culture or society, the dominant discourse, wants to view to some degree science and religion as being antithetical to one another, and that one should not use one in describing the other. Yet the cultural history that you do sort of describes that this wasn't always the case, doesn't have to be the case, and may not actually be as good a description of reality as people think it is. So can you talk a little bit about the scientification of religion?
Yeah. One thing about this knot or the braid, discursive braids, that it's a quite simple idea, basically, that if you think of one thing like religion or like whatever, the soul or something, or nature or something, then it does not really carry much meaning by itself. It only receives its meaning if you link it to something else, and that is what I call a discursive knot. So, or what you sometimes call strands, discourse strands, and they are woven together, or they meet, or something. And these strands change over time, and like Islam and fundamentalism, that changed the whole understanding, the orders of knowledge about Islam, if you link it to terrorism, if you link it to like what Mozart did to opium or to the harem or whatever in Orientalist fantasy. It's a completely different order of understanding of order of knowledge of Islam, and none of that is the real Islam. But these are very powerful knowledge structures, and they come together in these kind of bringing together discursive strands, like science and religion in the case you mentioned. And the interesting thing about the science-religion dichotomy is that in the 18th, 19th century, not many people talked about that. It was not a language that was actually used. Even the English term scientist as a kind of profession was first introduced into English language in the around 1850. Before that, they were all different. They were scholars, or they were philosophers, or that was a different language game, and therefore a different. There was no discourse on science and religion because nobody talked about that. There was discourse on religion, of course, but then that was linked to philosophy, to metaphysics, to all kinds of other to knowledge about nature, maybe, that later in the 20th century became science. So that's one thing that I find interesting if you look at these developments. And the scientification of religion has then several aspects. One is linked to the kind of emergence of all these academic professional disciplines that study religion, like the study of religion, obviously, but also anthropology, sociology of religion, then all these folklore studies that all emerged, and Indology, Tibetology, all these philological and studies that all emerged at the end of the 19th century and became legitimized knowledge, if you want, by their kind of institutionalization in universities. And the same is true for psychology, for instance, but also for theoretical physics or other sciences. So you have a kind of scientification of this knowledge about religion in very, very interesting ways. And it is not, at that time, it was not necessarily the understanding that the more science you have, the less religion you'll get. So that is something that basically came even more recently in the middle of the 20th century with this very strong kind of behavioristic approach in the sciences, but also in psychology, in sociology, and so on. So the experimental focus, that is only science, is basically a method that we apply, and that is a method of experimentation. And if you don't have that experimentation, then there is no science. And that, of course, is bad news for everything that's religion or metaphysics or philosophy or even quantum physics. And there are also problems with experimentation in some of the hard sciences. But these that was a kind of what you could call a dichotomization somehow of science and religion. And that basically started this kind of conflict theory that there were already in the 19th century. There were people who thought about the conflict theory of science against religion, but that was one camp of many others. And there were also many, it was not determined yet how this will turn out. And many people till the 1920s and 30s were interested in merging the sciences and the humanities. And they were looking for universal systems of knowledge and disciplines. And these were famous people. I mean, like Carl Gustav Jung in psychology, for instance, but also biologists like Ernst Haeckel, who looked for a bringing together scientific knowledge about the world with religious understandings of the cosmos. And this very strong dichotomy of science against religion was a paradigm that was actually not very long as a leading paradigm after the Second World War. And then soon it also became critiqued as a sign, because if you look at the real world, then you don't really see this strong differentiation between religion and science. And there are many scientists as well. I mean, Albert Einstein is a good example, who said that my religion is nature, right? I mean, he's of course obviously a celebrated scientist, so there's no doubt about that. But at the same time, he was one of the early representatives of nature-based spirituality in the 20th century. And there are so many other examples of that as well.
Yeah, so you mentioned the word spirituality, and I'd like to, I don't know, maybe it's my strange fascination with the turn of the 19th into the 20th centuries, but when you talk about that these were strands that were not always imagined as a dichotomy, as a binary, I think of the development of the spiritualist movement, both in the US and in Europe, right? And the idea that if you look at a lot of these people who are so keen to demonstrate the sort of the reality of a spiritual world or a spiritual presence or life after death, I mean, how many of them are scientists who are using their new toys, right? Their new instruments that had been developed for the purpose of studying the natural world to also try to demonstrate, catalog, prove the existence of a spiritual world or something other than the material world. And I see also, and if you could respond to that, and then also at the risk of using sort of a Tyler Fraserism, there's kind of a survival of that. I mean, I think about, from popular culture, contemporary like ghost hunting shows and things like that, where there's this idea that, one needs to marry together, scientific instruments in order to say something about a non-material world or a world beyond what we can see. So, I mean, one, is that the right track of development that I'm seeing there? And then two, is this a marginal thing, or do you think that this in the public discourses has got legs, is going to continue to grow?
I think that is spot on what you describe for in both parts of the question that you raised, and that's actually also what fascinated me, and that what brought me to write this most recent book about the cultural history of the soul, because it's a cultural history. You can also call it a discursive history, but that doesn't sell very well. So we opted for cultural history, but it's not about the soul as such. And some readers are disappointed that they still don't know what the soul is at the end of the book. But it is the book about exactly what you described, that 100 years ago or 120 years ago, there was a huge debate about what we today, and people at that point already called occultism. So there are occult, which is just hidden, the Latin word for hidden. So occultism is knowledge about the occult, the hidden powers of nature. And you may think of radioactivity, for instance, is an occult power of nature. We don't see it, but it's very powerful. Magnetism, electricity, all these things that were discovered or invented, if you want, came into being somehow at the end of the 19th century, and people were fascinated. And that is also the kind of environment where spiritualism grew. And the interesting thing is that if you look at the first movement to set up psychology as a professional discipline at the universities, it is exactly this interest that directed these moves. People were interested in what you can do with your soul, how you can materialize something. Can you get in touch with invisible layers of reality, with dead people, or with different civilizations somewhere, or can your thoughts materialize in distant and activity, and all these questions. And the first experimentation that they did were with these psychics, were with these kind of spiritualists, and they were so there was a long and very interesting discussion about that, and that was part of a larger frame, I think, also in philosophy, that is the mind-matter thing. And that was a major discussion at the point in art, in psychology, in physics, in how's the relationship between the material world and the spiritual world, basically. And there were all kinds of different approaches. Even in science, like the biologist I already mentioned, Ernst Haeckel, in his latest book, 1914, with the title "The Souls of Crystals," Kristallseelen. That's the book title, and that you have in the book title that he was one of the leading scientists at the time, and for him, it was very clear that all crystals, all stones, not all stones, but crystals, and then he categorized all the different crystals, had souls. So they were animated, and that this life was basically a component of material world. And that was like that. That's the second part of your question. So we had this very, very strong and influential occultism debate at the time. And I agree that the continuities are much stronger than you might expect until today. And in my book, I have one important phenomenon I see as an important juncture between this, and that is particularly in the US, is the transpersonal movement in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where these threads or these discursive kind of entanglements were coming together, and that created what we now today call, or some people call, the New Age movement, for instance, where mind and matter are thought together again, and where Carl Gustav Jung, one of the heroes of the earlier period, was revived and reapplied to questions of, for instance, nature and the cosmos as being alive, and all these questions. So yes, I think that there is a strong continuity, and I think if you look at discourses about soul, animism, so nature is animated, which anima is the Latin word for soul. Yeah? So in a discursive perspective, everything that is animated is about the soul. Yeah? So it's a discursive knot that links up with ideas about the soul. And that gives life. So the life force in biology, for instance, 100 years ago, they were thinking about it. What is the inherent power of life that makes a tree grow? That's not just measuring the bark, and that's part of what we do. But the real interesting thing for many people is what drives this tree. What is the life power, the life essence in it, and so on. And that there's some continuity. And what we see today, I think, is a revival, particularly when it comes to animated nature. If you look at all these bestsellers about tree consciousness, like Richard Powers' The Overstory, Pulitzer Prize and everything. So there are so many phenomena that revive this kind of spiritualization of nature, even in what we used to call the hard sciences.
Yeah, and I would guess that particularly in the US, I would guess that this gets supercharged by sort of liberalization of immigration laws in the United States in the 60s as well, right? That some of these ideas are sort of being reinforced by, for lack of a more specific term, Eastern spiritual ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you also see, and that's another dimension of scientification of religion, is that if you look at these new spiritualities that come up in the context of what sometimes is called the New Age movement in Esalen, for instance, and basically in California, and from there is spread out in other areas as well. Also before the 60s already, in the 50s and 40s, there was already. So it's what was not necessarily a new thing, but there are new practices and spiritualities coming up. And what you see in some of these is a very strong influence of scientists. And so these are also scientifically informed new spiritualities. If you look, for instance, at shamanism or paganism, or let's take shamanism, that if you look at all the major representatives still today, or since the 1970s till today, have a PhD in anthropology, or have at least masters in anthropology or in religious studies, or sometimes psychology. And so these are academic experts somehow, and then they explain to broader audience, and that adds legitimacy to what they say in a secular context. They know what they are talking about, and yet they are very into the spiritual dimensions, and they want to. So it is even the case that science can, and I include the humanities here, the secular sciences, knowledge systems can produce new spiritual activities and convictions and practices. And the same is true even for the hard sciences. If you look at quantum physics, for instance, the whole quantum mysticism that again was very prominent in the 70s and 80s in Esalen and elsewhere. And Fritjof Capra, for instance, who merged this quantum understanding, and he was also a scientist, but he spent time in Asia, and in Japan to learn the non-Western philosophies, like what you said, and that these are all examples of people who were breeding these discursive strands together somehow with their science and religion and spirituality, and that gave a boost to new kinds of identities. And what we see today, particularly, and since 1990s maybe, with a change of ecology. and that has everything to do with the climate crisis, of course. But so there's a sense of urgency, of course. But at the same time, there is an interest in non-reductionist body. And what Richard Powers describes in his novel, for instance, The Overstory, is something that is new forestry, and that is new biology that's non-reductionist, more holistic, that can easily be blended to understandings of tree consciousness, which is a huge boom all over the place, that trees are not only, and other life forms as well, are having their own intelligences. So they are animated, which is a discursive link between the soul and nature again. So they are somehow agents, they are persons, and there is a movement across the world to give personhood to non-humans, also legal standing, like to rivers and forests and so on. So that I would think that is a new development that's quite influential and certainly not marginal, like you said. I think Brontaylor, it's hard to measure this kind of in exact numbers, but I think there's a lot to say to confirm what Brontaylor calls the global greening of religion. That these what I would call this as a growing discursive blend of nature and spirituality that even enters kind of political documents like the UNESCO treaties and so on, where there's talk of kind of the age-old veneration of the oceans in indigenous cultures, for instance. That is not politics only or science only. No, that is also very spiritual discourse that's going on there, and in a secular context. But these are brought together somehow, and that does not represent a kind of dichotomy between science and religion anymore. This is a mesh of identities that come together in very, very complex ways.
So do you think that these discourses, I mean, like, so for example, you mentioned your cultural history of the soul, and you make in the subtitle the distinction Europe and North America from 1870 to the present. How much do you think the discursive, arena or the public discourse on these conversations is similar in Europe and in North America? And how much do, I don't know, say the rise of kind of an anti-intellectualism in the United States make these different conversations?
I think there's both. There's overlap and there are differences. And overlap is certainly in these intellectual traditions that are shared, and also you see this also in many biographies actually of migrants coming from Europe, and then during the war are refugees and to the US. So you can certainly see some continuities there, and you can also see differences, like what you said, that it is quite unique US context with this with a political tradition, with a cultural tradition, and all that. And at the same time, you cannot also say there is one European tradition. I mean, if you look at Europe today, it's a whole kind of patchwork of different understandings there, and therefore I would be hesitant saying that there's a European discourse that is in a clear way distinct from the US, and there is, when it comes to these spiritual practices, for instance, there's certainly a lot of overlap in the sense that shamanism, for instance, in particularly in Western Europe, looks. I mean, this kind of new shamanism looks very much like the US. I mean, it's also even imported from the US through the Michael Harner's Foundation. And then it is mixed in many other ways. The same is true for neo-pagan groups, for instance, where in Europe particularly, but also in different ways that can be connected to old Celtic traditions in the UK or to Viking traditions and it's also used in Central Europe as a kind of identity marker that is pre-socialist but also pre-Christian. So there is a kind of nationalist movement that reconstructs this kind of roots of the almost in a folkish way in some contexts. So there are all kinds of different ways of looking at that. But I think that these discursive worlds are very, very entangled, actually.
So, and I promised, and I'm coming back to it because I promised another objection. And so this is my not my objection, an objection that I've been thinking a lot about. And actually, while I want to frame it in reference to the methods of sort of discursive analysis, I think some of what you're talking about, the resurgence of sort of identity markers and, whether those be pre-Christian, nationalistic, et cetera, tie into this. And so here it is. That in the beginning, right, the postmodern turn was really a very leftist kind of a thing, right? That it was emerging in the 60s and the 70s as being sort of a questioning of institutions, of social patterns, of authority, in sort of in step with the counterculture a little bit, or more than a little bit, actually. Mm-hmm. In the past several years, though, the tools of postmodernism seem to be sort of creeping into the toolbox and discursive analysis for that matter, seem to be creeping into the toolbox of authoritarianism in lots of different contexts. So questioning the nature of reality, describing, the denial effects on the ground, right, with an argument that there are alternative versions of the same history. Is this inevitable that this is not just sort of a toolkit of the left, but then ends up being sort of spread? I'm not going to ask you for the answer to this, but just, am I reading that phenomena right, or those phenomena right, that this is something that is sort of spreading and being used in various other cultural contexts than the one it grew up in?
Absolutely, and I fully agree with that observation. What we see is that these tools and these critical deconstruction, or whatever you want to call that had a certain kind of root in countercultures and critical leftist kind of readings of hegemonic discourses and so on, that are also used in other milieus and applied to other questions as well, and used as legitimization. And you hear these discussions very often. And one example of that is also, if everything is constructed, then we cannot really attack fake news. So there are no fake facts. If all facts are basically fake, like what the radical postmodernists allegedly said. Nobody really said that. But it's also a misreading of a lot what's going on in that. But then it's turned into anything goes, right? And that is not what these people, actually, these theorists, said, but which is how much of that comes across easily, and then it can be used like that. And the answer then is not, okay, well, then we have to pretend that we know the truth. I don't think that is very useful. But I think what is important is to understand that it does not mean that anything goes, that it does not matter what I claim. It only means that whatever I claim is coming from a certain position of perspectivity. and a certain perspectival kind of understanding of reality. And I still, as a scholar, I am accountable of what I do. And as a journalist and as a political leader and all, I am accountable to what I say. And that then the interesting question is, what are the criteria of accountability? And that's, I think, what we need to talk about. And that's what Laurie Patton writes about in the institutional responsibility that we have as scholars, for instance, that we always have to make clear that our privileged situation, or more or less privileged situation, has certain influence on what we are saying, which does not mean that we make things up. Yeah? And that's also this nice distinction between making things up does not mean that things are made. They are made. Things are made, but they are not made up. That's so. These distinctions are important to keep, I think.
All right. Well, Kocku von Stuckrad, thank you very much for this. This has been super fun and super enlightening, and I really appreciate you coming on ReligionWise.
Thank you so much for the conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
This has been ReligionWise, a podcast produced by the Institute for Religious and Cultural Understanding of Muhlenberg College. ReligionWise is produced and directed by Christine Flicker. For more information about additional programming, or to make an inquiry about a speaking engagement, please visit our website at religionandculture.com. There, you'll find our contact information, links to other programming, and have the opportunity to support the work of the Institute. Please subscribe to ReligionWise wherever you get your podcasts. We look forward to seeing you next time.